Hi everyone. I'm just doing a little recording so that I can go over the worksheet here, the handout and study guide you created for conservatism. This is what we would have done in class if my son hadn't been sick. But I just want to explain the points. I prefer to do it in class when we have a discussion because then I can see where you're confused by what I'm saying and the point that's being raised. And I can't do that here, but it's much more direct, and I need to make sure we stay a little bit on track. We're a little off track here in terms of timing, so I want to make sure we get this so we can do what I was planning on for Friday. So to begin, if we look at conservatism, the general principles here, and just like the liberalism in any ideology, there's certain assumptions that are made. And for conservatism, the first one is going to be that humans are weak by nature. So just that we're bad, and this is generally held out by looking around and people do what are self-interested, do what they want for themselves, and that leads them to being bad because they're not going to worry about other people. The other assumption is that there's been problems in society for a long time, that we have there's problems right now. There's no question about that. But if we look back at our history, we can identify times where we've been much better. For a lot of conservatives, this is looking in the 50s and early 60s. It seems like that was a much safer time. There was less crime. People were working. So it seems like that's a better time. And that if we can just overcome these problems, we can return our society to this great land it was at one time. So that's the assumption, that it doesn't have to just go to a peak and then come back down. So we can get better, but what better means here in this context is going to be a little different than what liberalism generally thinks. So to begin then, the general principles is that conservatism, as I've been trying to stress in class, is worried about taking care of society first. Okay, the individual comes second. And again, conservatives don't say people don't have rights. That only thing that matters is society. The idea here is that without society being strong, there's no way individuals can have rights, because the main emphasis of society is to be there to ensure that people have their rights. So in order to secure those rights, it's necessary for society to be strong. And that means we got to take care of society first. One of the things that are out there right now is, what do we do with people who want to commit terrorist acts? Is it more important to protect the individual rights and let people have freedoms, or should we worry about safety? And safety is a social issue. Should we restrict certain rights in order to secure safety? That's the debate that goes on here between conservatism and liberalism. Liberalism is going to say no, the most important thing are the rights. Conservatives say no, we got to make it a strong society, make it secure, safe, and then we can have the rights, because without that security, we're not going to have rights. So that's why society comes first. That's what they're talking about. In all of our institutions, and should be striving for that. Second one is that it's necessary, in order to ensure we have a strong society, strong workforce, in order to produce a well-structured society. Okay, so by getting that strong cultural heritage and having people ready to work, that's what's going to lead to a society being well structured, and then people will benefit. So again, we're back to that first point in a way, but this now is talking about what are we going to do this, and that's strong cultural heritage. If you identify with society, you're going to defend it, support it, and if you have the skills necessary to go to work, that's going to make society better. So everybody's working, we're prosperous, we can have what we want. Okay, so again, individuals are going to benefit with freedoms and a good life. They're going to have a high standard of living, but it's up to us to get society strong in the first place. So that's where we want to start. Okay, now if we look at who some of these people are that are of this view, you can find trends of this in Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Luther. The most well-known one right now is Edmund Burke. He's more relatively recent than some of the other ones, but they're all of the idea that it's important to have a good society. How they see that changes between them, and yes, Locke is of the same agreement, but other Enlightenment thinkers like Locke are generally aligned more with liberalism. So there's a long tradition of this, even though it's not as well recognized in our society in terms of the philosophical foundations, because we're so aligned with people like Locke and Mill and the importance of having individual rights. So that's where it comes from. Doesn't mean that the conservatives disagree with those people like Locke and Mill and all the other Enlightenment thinkers. It's just that they see before you can have those, you need society to be strong in the first place. Okay? So that's the general principle. All of the way they look at what should be done in society and the institutions we have are going to conform to those principles. So now, if we look at this in terms of education directly, we can notice a couple of things. So one of the first things here, and these are pretty much the order that were presented in the worksheet, so there's no real order here. You can organize them how you want. First thing is, what schools need to do is they have to introduce and transmit our cultural heritage. This goes back to the idea that we have to recognize the importance of our society, feel connected to it, and to do that we need to understand what our cultural heritage is. And if you think about it in elementary school, one of those first things you learn are the symbols of patriotism, the flag, the eagle, all of that, our founding fathers, all of those things are meant to tie us to this society. So schools need to be able to introduce this to students and transmit that cultural heritage to students. Otherwise, they're just on their own and they don't really feel any tie to the society. Second, and this goes right into the next one, is what's really important is we have to stress American patriotism. And you can see this in what people are arguing for. We've lost what makes America great. Those type of slogans and the importance of saying the Pledge of Allegiance, standing during the national anthem. The people who are presenting those and making those claims are pointing to this kind of idea that schools and the subjects that we teach in there must emphasize the achievements of America and help us understand why we're good. What makes society great? That's what we want to be stressing. So we need to not limit that downgrading of society. So if that means we can't dismiss some of the things that have been done in society, but we have to balance those off is the language they're going to use. So yeah, there was slavery, but it's part of our history. We have to understand that we've come a long way since then. That type of approach is how they're going to address those issues. You don't want to emphasize the negatives as much because you need to ensure students are connecting to the society. And then if we turn specifically to the curriculum, the emphasis here is going to be on Western civilization and American culture. Let's face it, we came from Europe. The dominant culture of American society is European based. So we need to recognize this. Yes, we've evolved and our society changes. It's not the same as it was 200 years ago. But we also have to recognize where we came from. And so we need to respect this past and this tradition that we've come out of. That's why we spend so much time doing American literature, American history. That's how we understand who we are and where we came from. Once schools are able to connect students to that idea, that will help them become more connected to society and supportive of it, and that'll make society stronger. Now, one of the things that kind of shifting away from the idea of our cultural heritage issues, which those first three are kind of tied into that, is the idea that conservatives really stress this standardized testing. Right? This is where a lot of this comes from, because we have a standard of excellence that's existed in our society, and the only way to make sure we're still meeting that is if we can test every student and make sure they're living up to those standards that we have. And again, if we look at this, people are going to point back to the 50s where it was unquestioned that the U.S. educational system was the highest ever. We were producing more PhDs, more scientists, more doctors, everything. This was what we did. So we need a way to ensure and measure ourselves against that. Are we living up to that? And the evidence seems to point no, we're not as strong as other countries now. They're kind of catching up to us. Some of them are even passing us. So in order to assure that we're making that level of achievement to get us back to the top, so to speak, we need to have standardized testing so we can assure who's getting the best, and then who doesn't make it, we got to help them out. So that's why standardized testing then becomes important for this ideology applied to education. And finally, and this goes back to the idea that humans are bad. Ties right into this assumption. It's very important for students to teach values and civility in order to become ethical relativism. Clearly there are things that are right and wrong, and students need to learn those. If they don't, they're going to do what's bad. That's the assumption. That's human nature. So, if we don't have a place for them to learn this, they're never going to pick it up. So that becomes important for schools to teach those values. And they're the basic values associated with being good people, law-abiding citizens, and basic civility. That's the idea that they're talking about. So this becomes a very key element in education. So that's why there's a lot of discussion at times over what should be taught and whether or not the schools are responsible for teaching values to students, or is it the parents' responsibility? For conservatism, they recognize not all students are learning it, so it becomes important that it be taught in the schools. No, and I didn't list this on the criticism, but you should be able to see right away one of the criticisms is going to go back to the same thing with the essentialist curriculum, which talked about values, whose values are we talking about? So that becomes a criticism. I didn't list it, but that is one of the other criticisms, and it's tied right into that point. So now, once we've applied this, now why should we adopt this ideology? Why should this be the dominant ideology of our society? First thing, what they're going to argue for here is that if we forget about what worked in the past, liberalism is talking about we've got to find new solutions, new ideas to solve our problems. The conservatives are going to argue if we forget about what worked in the past and just doing whatever is exciting at the moment, we're not going to be able to succeed. Okay, people are just doing what they want. They're underachievers then. We have to take those lessons from the past and apply them to today. So we need to remember the past. And that's what's emphasized in this curriculum and this approach to education, is that emphasis on our past, our heritage, our traditions, our culture. We were great. We can get back there. We just got to get back to what we were doing before. So that's the emphasis then. And similarly, along those lines is when we're talking about what we got to learn, George Santayana's quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." There's an emphasis here that we need to remember what society has done so we don't make the same mistakes. We seem to be doing that. We're back slipping into what we did before that didn't work. So now we need to go back to doing that. And again, this does not mean that we need to eliminate people's rights. But at a time when we were a stronger society, according to this ideology, people didn't have the same kind of rights. They knew the limits of their rights. So maybe we have to go back to that. In order to make society stronger, it means that we have to protect those rights of certain individuals, and we have to focus on protecting them. And that may mean it's necessary to decide where they start to overlap and what's more important. And again, we can think about the question that's going on now. What's more important? Individual safety or individual rights and freedom of expression? So those ideas are what ground this theory and why people argue for it. And finally, there's two criticisms here. These are bigger ones that are out there on this. I already mentioned the one, if we look at the values part of it, that's a criticism. Whose values are we talking about? Conservative values may not be the same as liberal values, so that becomes an issue in a debate. And I didn't put that one on here, but there is, because there's two other ones that are out there as well. And these are probably not ones you would immediately think of and spot, so that's why I wanted to stress these a little bit. First, there's very definite negative trend in view of human nature, how society exists. And a criticism that can be raised is if we're emphasizing all this negativity that exists in society, that doesn't really promote any kind of positive approach to solving problems and moving society. It's just talking about the badness. And if you're always talking about the badness that's going on and how it's bad it's become, you're more likely to lead to negative aspects and people just focusing on that, and that's all they worry about. Oh, it's so bad. But in order to improve it, we need something more positive. We need that creativity that comes with thinking of new solutions and not necessarily thinking just about the negatives. Yes, we have to think about the negatives, but not to the detriment where we're not thinking about ways to improve society. So by emphasizing that negative a little too much is a criticism of this theory. And the other one is, and I call this the Olympic criticism. If you ever watch the Olympics, especially the Summer Olympics since they're bigger, and if they're in overseas, the crowd you can hear the most, and part of it's just the way the cameras are because we're watching American TV, but you can always hear the chants USA, USA, USA. We're known in the world as kind of overly full of ourselves, to put it mildly. So this emphasis on American traditions and heritage that comes in through the conservative ideology in the schools and in the curriculum can lead to other non-desired moral attitudes. Okay, we definitely, as Americans, think ourselves better than a lot of people in the world, and we just do it. We do things because we're Americans. That's the way it's done. We know what's best, so we've got to decide that. It's strong patriotism. That's fine, but it's taken too far, according to this criticism, is that it's leading us to these certain attitudes of superiority, that everybody else is worse. And that is ethnocentrism. So we're focused around ourselves and that's it. Really, we need to start looking more as global citizens in the world and start interacting with people as opposed to overemphasizing our traditions and our heritage. See ourselves as part of the world, not necessarily as distinct and unique and better from the world. Okay? So that's the basic ideas of these. See, it's a little quicker if I just talk, not as quite as interesting, but that should give you some ideas so we can jump back into where we're doing and try to get caught up here, as so that we can get through all of this material because of the big project, which I will explain when we get back from break. And I want to make sure I give you as much time as possible to work on that. Okay. All right. If you have questions, write them down, bring them in. We'll definitely go over this a little bit more in class on Friday. See you then.